A knife scores the bark of a desert tree, and the wound begins to bleed white. The sap wells up slow and pale, hardens in the sun, and is carried away in sacks worth their weight in silver. For most of recorded history, this resin was burned by the ton inside the holiest room a people owned. They called the smoke prayer. 20 centuries later, a laboratory found something genuinely brain-active hiding inside that resin, and the internet decided it had proof that the temple smoke was a drug. It's a good story. It's mostly wrong. And the real one is stranger. The Hebrews had a single word for this substance, and the word was a color, livona, from Lavan, white. The Greeks called it Libanos. We call it frankincense. And for 3,000 years it sat at the exact seam where worship met medicine, where the smoke rising off an altar and the powder packed into an open wound came from the same tree on the same mountain. This is the story of what that tree actually does to a body and to a brain, where the science confirms the ancients, where it quietly corrects them, and where the most famous modern claim about frankincense falls apart the moment you read the study it came from. The tree is Boswellia sacra, and it grows where almost nothing should. It clings to bare limestone in the Dhofar Mountains of Oman and the dry highlands of Yemen and the Horn of Africa, roots gripping rock, surviving on sea fog. To harvest it, you wound it. A harvester scores the bark. The tree weeps a pale tear to seal the cut, and that hardened tear is the frankincense. Cut it again a few weeks later and it weeps whiter. Cut it a third time and you get the purest grade of all. That whiteness is the whole point. When the book of Exodus specifies the incense of the sanctuary, it does not just ask for frankincense, it asks for livona zaka, frankincense that is pure. The Hebrew adjective is doing the work your eyes would do at the market stall. The whitest tears were the cleanest, the costliest, the only grade fit to burn before God. Here we have to be honest about a thing most documentaries gloss. We like to say the frankincense of the Bible is Boswellia sacra, the Arabian species. The truth is looser. A merchant in Jerusalem was buying a grade, not a botanist's specimen, and the caravans almost certainly mixed in other species from across the Red Sea. The scholarly consensus lands here. The resin that dominated the Israelite altar was overwhelmingly the Arabian tree, fed up the trade routes from the south. But frankincense was a category of quality long before it was a name on a Linnaean chart. And those trade routes built empires. The resin moved up the Incense Road, out of Dhofar, through the kingdom of Sheba, north through the deserts to Gaza and the Mediterranean. It was a journey of more than 1,000 miles by camel, and whoever sat astride a stretch of it taxed what passed. The kingdoms of southern Arabia and later the Nabateans who controlled the desert crossings grew fabulously rich as the middlemen of smoke. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, gives us the receipt. The best frankincense, 6 denarii a pound. 2 days' wages for a Roman laborer, for a handful of hardened sap. And Pliny tells us how a buyer tested it, pressing it for whiteness, for stickiness, for how readily it caught a flame. Was Judah really plugged into this? We don't have to guess. In 2020, researchers analyzed the dark residue crusted on 2 limestone altars from an 8th century BC shrine at Tel Arad on the southern edge of the kingdom. The larger altar gave up its chemistry, boswellic acid, the molecular fingerprint of frankincense, real Arabian resin burned on a Judahite altar 700 years before the Magi. The smoke in the scriptures was never a literary flourish. It was an import the kingdom paid dearly for, so they burned it. And to understand this video's strangest turn, you have to understand how much they burned. The instructions are laid out in Exodus. A golden altar set directly before the veil of the Holy of Holies, and on it, incense. Not occasionally. Every morning when the priest trimmed the lamps, and again at twilight when he lit them, a standing offering, the text says, throughout your generations. Frankincense was one of its 4 named ingredients, and later, Jewish tradition expanded the recipe into 11 spices, recorded in the Talmud with a chilling clause. Leave one ingredient out, and the priest who compounded it was liable to death. Now, a careful word. That 11-spice formula and the picture of unbroken twice-daily smoke for 1,000 years is the priestly ideal, the blueprint of perpetual holiness, more than it is a guaranteed historical fact across the chaos of the centuries. But the volume implied is staggering. By the rabbi's own reckoning, the annual supply ran to something like 1.75 tons of incense. One tractate keeps a memory of what that did to the air. From Jericho, they said, miles away, you could smell the day the incense was compounded. A man swore his family's goats sneezed from it. And the meaning of all that smoke was fixed, early and everywhere. The smoke was prayer. Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, sings the psalm. In the book of Revelation, the image hardens into furniture. Golden bowls of incense that are, the text says outright, the prayers of the saints, rising. When the priest Zechariah disappears into the sanctuary in Luke's Gospel to burn the incense, the whole crowd stands praying outside in the smoke's hour, and that is the moment the angel chooses to appear. The rising smoke was the visible shape of an invisible thing. You could watch your prayer climb, which brings us to the laboratory and the claim you have probably seen. In 2008, a team published a paper with an irresistible title. That incensol acetate, a compound in boswellia resin, elicits psychoactivity by activating TRPV3 channels in the brain. In plain terms, they found a molecule in frankincense that acts on the brain, and in their animals, it eased anxiety and lifted depression-like behavior. The headlines wrote themselves, "Ancient Temple Incense, a Natural Antidepressant." The priests, it seemed, had been medicating the whole congregation for 3,000 years without knowing it. It is a beautiful idea. So let's do the thing this channel exists to do, and actually read the study. The animals were mice, and the mice did not breathe anything. The compound was purified in a lab and injected into the abdomen at doses around 50 to 75 milligrams per kilogram. That is the finding. An injected molecule changed behavior in a mouse. It is a real, careful, peer-reviewed result. It is also nothing like a worshiper standing in a cloud of smoke, because the harder question is the one the headlines never asked. Does that molecule even survive the fire? When you set frankincense on a coal at 700–800 degrees, does incensol acetate rise intact in the smoke, or does it break apart in the heat? Someone checked. The one study that actually burned Arabian frankincense and read the smoke found the resin's large molecules degrading into simpler compounds, not floating up whole. Broader chemical surveys of incense smoke don't find incensol acetate in it at all. The molecule is real. It's in the resin. On the current evidence, it is not in the smoke. Here is the honest sentence, the one a pharmacologist would sign. Frankincense resin contains a molecule that acts on the brain when you inject it into a mouse. Whether the smoke of burning frankincense delivers that molecule to a human brain is unknown. No one has shown it survives the fire, and no one has measured a dose in a person. The pharmacology is real. The bridge from the incense right to the brain has not been built. So what was the calm of the sanctuary? It was real experience and real theology, the smoke as prayer made visible, the most powerful sensory act a people had. It was not, as far as anyone has shown, a drug carried on the air. And noticing that difference, refusing the easy headline, is the whole reason a channel like this exists. If you want to find the loose threads in a story everyone thinks they know, go to the part everyone can recite. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Matthew's Gospel gives the Magi 3 gifts, and the Church spent the next few centuries deciding what each one meant. The most enduring reading comes from Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century. gold for a king, myrrh for a mortal man who would die, and frankincense, incense, the stuff of the altar, offered to him as to a god. Irenaeus said nearly the same a little earlier: gold for the kingship, myrrh for the burial, frankincense for the divinity. It is elegant, and it has been preached for 1800 years. It is also, the best modern scholars caution, almost certainly read backward into the text. Raymond Brown, whose study of the nativity narratives is the standard work, makes the point plainly. In the world that produced this gospel, gold and frankincense and myrrh were simply the highest value luxuries of the East, the normal tribute you laid before a sovereign. The first-century writer may have meant nothing more theological than that. The frankincense equals divinity code is the Church's later poetry, not the page's stated intent. But there is one fingerprint in the text worth pressing. 7 centuries before Matthew, the prophet Isaiah had already pictured this scene. Nations streaming to a restored Jerusalem, bringing gold and frankincense. 2 gifts, not 3. Isaiah's vision is pure glory, and glory has no room for myrrh, the bitter resin of embalming and the grave. Matthew knew that passage cold, and when he set the Magi down before the child, he added the 3rd gift back in. He put the burial spice into the cradle. The kingship and the godhood were never going to be the whole story. If you find that kind of reading rewarding, the place where the text and the chemistry and the history all press on each other, subscribe. The next one walks straight out of this one. Because frankincense's companion in that treasure chest, myrrh, has a story of its own, and we've already told it. There's one more thing hiding in the Magi's gift, and it sets up everything that follows. In the ancient world, frankincense was also a serious medicine. The Greek and Roman physicians did not file frankincense under perfume. They filed it under pharmacy. Dioscorides, whose herbal was the reference text of the Western world for 15 centuries, lists frankincense as an astringent that stops bleeding, fills the hollows of deep ulcers, and calms inflammation of the eye. Celsus, cataloging Roman wound care, names it twice over. Among the substances that suppress bleeding, and among those that close a wound, myrrh, frankincense, gums. The Egyptians were there long before either of them. A prescription in the Ebers Papyrus, 15 centuries before Christ, has the physician mixing frankincense into a dressing and binding it to the wound. The Magi were not only honoring a king, they were handing over a chest of the best trauma medicine the ancient world possessed. And here, unlike the smoke the modern science holds, within limits, we're going to state plainly. Frankincense resin contains a family of compounds called boswellic acids, and the most active of them carries a name as ungainly as it is precise: acetyl-keto-boswellic acid. It blocks an enzyme called 5-lipoxygenase, which is one of the body's switches for making the molecules that drive inflammation. It is a different switch from the 1-aspirin and ibuprofen flip, which is part of what made it interesting. That mechanism is solid, it has been mapped in the lab, and it has been carried into actual human trials. There's a catch worth naming, because it keeps this honest. The compound is poorly absorbed when you swallow it. What works in a dish does not automatically reach the joint in a pill. And commercial supplements vary so wildly in how much of it they contain that the word frankincense on a label guarantees almost nothing. So the question was never whether the chemistry exists. It was whether it survives the trip into a living person and does measurable good. And there, the answer is a careful one. This is where most channels would tell you frankincense cures everything. It doesn't, and the honest map matters. The strongest evidence is for the arthritic knee. Across several controlled trials and a pooled analysis, boswellia extract eased pain and improved function in osteoarthritis. There's a single good trial showing it reduced the dangerous brain swelling that radiation causes in cancer patients. Promising, but one study. For inflamed bowel disease, the results are thinner, and the best-run trial of all, testing it to keep Crohn's disease in remission, simply failed. One reviewer's summary is the fairest line anyone has written about it. The evidence is encouraging, but not compelling. There is one more twist, and it lands like a gift. Nearly all of those human trials were run on the Indian species of frankincense, the one that's cheap and farmed at scale, not the Arabian tree of the scriptures. So you'd assume the biblical resin was the lesser medicine. It's the opposite. When chemists measure the key active compound, the Arabian boswellia sacra of the temple altar carries roughly 10 times more of it than the Indian species the studies used. The resin the priests reserved for God was, as it happens, the richest in the molecule that actually works. No one has run the trial on it, but of all the frankincense on earth, the scriptural grade is the one you'd bet on. So we are left with two truths that don't quite rhyme, and the refusal to force them together is the point. The resin heals, modestly, specifically, in the joints, and maybe the swollen brain, and richest of all in the very grade burned before the ark. The smoke does not drug you. It never did. What the smoke did was older and harder to measure than any molecule. It gave a people a way to watch their prayers rise twice a day in a cloud that reached the rafters and drifted as far as the next town's goats. Modern chemistry found a brain-active molecule in the resin, and then, being honest, admitted it could not find that molecule in the smoke. It named the compound in the wound that actually closes inflammation, and then admitted the strongest trials were small and funded by the people selling the extract. That is not a failure of the story. That is the story. The ancients were not encoding a pharmacology they couldn't see. They were doing two true things at once, treating the body with a real medicine and lifting the spirit with a real rite. And we have spent 2,000 years learning exactly how far each one reaches. On a limestone altar at the edge of Judah, the residue is still there. Boswellic acid, burned to smoke in the 8th century before Christ. They paid a laborer's wages for a handful of it and set it on fire on purpose. We can now name the molecules in that ash and the channels in the brain and draw the careful line between what the smoke was and what we wish it had been. The naming changes nothing they felt rising over the altar. It only refuses to sell it as more than it was. These are the sacred remedies. And the most sacred thing about them may be telling the truth about where the medicine ends and the prayer begins.